I can direct a film, but I cannot direct my child's life. It's a sentence that sounds simple at first, almost understated, but the longer you sit with it, the heavier it becomes. That line has followed Rob Reiner for years. Not because it came from one of his films, but because it came from the one place he never learned how to control, his own life as a father. When fragments of that quote began circulating online, whispers followed. Some people misinterpreted it, others exaggerated it. A few even attached it to rumors that were never confirmed. What mattered wasn't the speculation, but why the sentence existed at all. Behind the director of When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, and Stand By Me, there was a man quietly living with a truth no amount of success could undo. A father watching a story unfold that he couldn't rewrite. And just weeks before one of his most emotionally raw public reflections, Rob Reiner finally said something he had avoided admitting for decades, something that stripped away the image of control people had always associated with him. "The boy has been through rehab more times than I can count," he admitted. "And I've learned something terrifying: love doesn't always save people." But to understand how a man who spent his life telling stories about hope arrived at that realization, you have to go back much further, back to the pressure that started long before addiction ever entered the picture. Nick Reiner was born in 1993, the son of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner. From the outside, his life looked almost unreal. His grandfather was Carl Reiner, one of the most influential figures in American comedy. His father was Rob Reiner, a director whose films didn't just succeed, they became cultural reference points. For most people, that kind of family history would sound like a dream. For a child growing up inside it, it was something else entirely. Because legacy doesn't arrive gently, it doesn't explain itself, it simply exists, large, immovable, and always watching. Nick didn't grow up lacking opportunity. He lacked something far less visible, the freedom to be average, to fail quietly, to exist without comparison. He didn't need anyone to tell him what was expected. The expectations were already in the room. And from the beginning, those expectations shaped the relationship between father and son in ways neither of them fully understood at the time. Rob Reiner loved his son, that part was never in question, but love doesn't always arrive in the form a child needs. Rob's life revolved around film sets, deadlines, scripts, and production schedules. He was present but often divided, available but not always reachable in the way that builds emotional grounding. Nick later admitted that they were never especially close during his childhood, not distant, just not anchored. And when you grow up under towering names, distance doesn't feel neutral, it feels like absence. Around Nick, the rest of the family found their footing. Jake Reiner built a career as an actor, writer, and producer. Romy Reiner pursued acting through independent projects. Tracy Reiner, whom Rob adopted, steadily carved out her own place in the industry. Nick was the only one whose path didn't stabilize, not because he lacked talent. Not because doors were closed, but because something inside him never settled long enough to step forward, and that internal struggle would soon begin to surface. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment that announced something was wrong. It started quietly. Nick began coming home later, conversations shortened, eye contact faded. He wasn't rebellious, he wasn't destructive. He was just slowly pulling away. Rob later said that, at the time, it all felt like normal adolescence. The kind of thing busy parents convince themselves will pass on its own. Nick started drinking around the age of 15. At first, it seemed harmless, experimental, easy to dismiss, but alcohol wasn't the point. Silence was. For the first time, Nick found moments where the pressure stopped speaking, where the expectations loosened their grip. Where he wasn't Rob Reiner's son or Carl Reiner's grandson, he was just someone allowed to exist. And once you discover that kind of relief, it's hard to walk away from it. When Rob finally confronted his son, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten, he didn't posture. He spoke carefully, like a man who still believed honesty could fix things. Nick listened, nodded, said he understood. And for a while, it looked like the conversation had worked. Nick stayed home more, kept his promises just enough, answered questions without resistance. There was no evidence that things were truly better. But there was also nothing alarming enough to destroy hope, and that fragile calm did something dangerous. It made Rob believe they had turned a corner. Then Nick entered rehab for the first time. Rob waited, held on to faith. Watched closely for signs that it had changed something, but recovery didn't fail loudly, it faded quietly. What followed wasn't one relapse, but many. Nick entered treatment again and again and again. Each time, Rob was there when he came out. No cameras, no statements, just a father waiting, but addiction doesn't respond to presence alone. Rob later admitted something few parents are prepared to say out loud, that repeated hope eventually becomes something you have to ration, just to survive emotionally. There's a point, he said, where you don't stop loving your child, you just learn how to expect less, so it hurts a little less when things fall apart again. Nick entered rehab more than a dozen times. Reports suggest the number may have reached 17, though Rob himself has framed this as an example of repetition rather than a statistic. There were periods when Nick refused treatment altogether. Times when he drifted, disconnected, and lived without stability. Each return didn't increase distance between them, it increased weight. Eventually, Rob did something many people considered risky. He brought the story to the screen. Being Charlie wasn't made as entertainment. It wasn't a message. And it wasn't an attempt to save anyone. It was an attempt to understand. The film follows a young man trapped between addiction and the love of his family, unable to accept either fully. Many viewers saw it as deeply personal. Rob didn't deny that. "I didn't make the film to save my son," he said. "I made it to understand him." Nick knew what the film represented. They talked, but cautiously, not in emotional monologues, in short exchanges, careful not to break whatever fragile connection still existed. Nick later said that watching his father work, watching him quietly shape something meaningful, helped him understand love in a way words never had. But understanding didn't cure anything. Love didn't create a miracle. And the struggle continued. As Rob navigated his son's ongoing battle, he faced another loss. Carl Reiner passed away. To the world, it was the end of a legendary life. To Rob, it was the loss of his anchor. Carl wasn't just his father. He was the one voice Rob trusted without question, the one person who could challenge him without judgment. Carl never pressured Rob to succeed. That pressure came from respect, and when Carl was gone, something changed permanently. Rob found himself reaching for his phone out of habit, then stopping. The person he needed to talk to no longer existed on the other end of the line. And for the first time, Rob felt the loneliness of aging, not from isolation, but from the absence of understanding. Rob Reiner kept working, kept writing, kept pitching, but Hollywood had changed. Meetings became shorter, replies slowed. Projects weren't rejected, they were simply forgotten. There was no dramatic fall, just gradual disappearance. He noticed it in how people spoke about him, always referencing the past. "You made When Harry Met Sally," as if everything after that was an afterthought. Rob wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter. He recognized the pattern because it felt familiar. It was the same slow retreat he had once watched happen in his own family. In his later years, Rob became more outspoken politically, not for attention, but because he believed silence carried its own cost. That honesty came with consequences. Some people turned away, some friendships faded. Conversations grew careful, then rare. Rob understood the trade-off. He didn't regret speaking, but he felt the loneliness that followed. There were moments when he wondered if being quieter would have preserved something familiar. And each time he answered himself the same way. Silence purchased at the cost of conviction isn't peace, it's surrender. Rob Reiner spent his life telling stories about hope, about people finding one another again, about decency surviving hardship, about love being enough. His own life taught him something more complicated. That love doesn't always save people, that understanding doesn't guarantee healing, that some stories don't resolve, and perhaps that's why the line still lingers. "I can direct a film, but I cannot direct my child's life." It wasn't a confession of failure. It was an admission of truth. A man who controlled the emotional rhythm of millions had to learn how to live inside a story he could not shape, and maybe that's what makes him human. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that don't come with perfect endings. Thank you for staying until the very last moment.